Full Bloom is brought to you in part by the following. Welcome to Full Bloom, the award-winning show that celebrates life. Here's your host, Zita Christian.
Hi everyone, welcome to Full Bloom. I'm Zita Christian. Tonight we're going to talk about women at sea, but not women at sea today. We're talking about women going to sea in the Victorian era. And my guest knows all about it. She's a historian, she's a writer, she's multi-talented. Please join me in welcoming Karlee Turner. Karlee, thanks for being on the show tonight.
Thank you, Zita.
Now, I want to jump in by sharing with the viewer something that I found on your website. It's a little quote, and it says, "Believe it or not, between 1840 and 1860, many women from Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York braved the status quo, threw caution to the wind, and set sail with their husbands. As the master of sailing vessels, whaling captains expected to be away from their home and families for 2 or more years." That's the information you're sharing with the world. So, Karlee, I look at that and I think that has to be a fascinating life, but I wouldn't do it. Why on earth would a woman want to go to sea on a whaling vessel knowing she's going to be away from her home for up to 2 or more years?
Well, there were a number of factors. First of all, we have to remember that women couldn't work and didn't work much, especially after they were married. So They were totally dependent on their husband for their income. Mm-hmm. And their husband, as you said, was gone for an average of 3 to 5 or sometimes 6 years. Mm. And during that time, before he left, he would give her a certain amount of money, and that would have to last her till he returned home, if he returned home. And there's a story of one woman, a real woman, who was married for 10 years, and in those 10 years, she saw her husband for mere 9 months.
Oh my gosh.
So a lot of the women decided that they prefer to be with their husbands, even if that meant they were facing death and drowning at sea, than to be separated from them. After all, they were married, they were to have their home, be the center of the home, keep the hearth fires burning. And so they did so while they were on board a ship. And so many of the women, when you ask them, well, we can't ask them, but when you're reading their journals, mm-hmm. their opinions, a lot of them felt that if the Lord so called us home, then at least we'd be together. So they felt that it was the lesser of evils to go with, not all of them, we're not saying all of the women did that, but quite a few chose to go with their husbands than to remain at home.
But these women who did make that choice to go with their husbands, the husband, as far as I know, was only the captain, right?
Correct.
Not other members of the crew.
There's one incident where there was actually a first mate, or the first officer had his wife with him too, but they were related to the captain, whether it was a sister-in-law, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, or it was related. Mm-hmm. So, but
what about? Oh, I'm sorry.
That's right. Go ahead.
What about children? Did their children ever come?
Some children went, others remained behind. It was up to the parents. There, one woman, Mary Lawrence, I believe, I can't remember her name. No, Martha Brown, had a 5-year-old daughter that she left at home, and actually had a son while she was away. And she decided, for whatever reason, that she preferred to leave her child at home in the care of relatives than to take her with them. But there were children that were also born on board a ship.
I was just going to ask you, you mentioned about that she had a son. So here's a woman on board a ship. She gets pregnant. She has a child. And except for that incident, the situation you mentioned where the first officer also had his wife on board, here are women there are no other women on board.
No.
Okay, I'm a little nervous about that.
It was one of the things that was most difficult about being at sea was not having, as they referred to it, the society of other women. They didn't have the women's groups that were getting together and sewing once a week. They didn't have the women they could go calling on during the day to visit with. They didn't have their church. There was a lot of things that they were lacking. But the fact that they were with their husbands made up for that. But they did look forward to being in port. And one of the favorite places that the whale ships stayed was at Lahaina, Maui.
Oh, well, favorite.
Yes,
sure.
and they could always count on, especially if it was the spring or the fall, that there were going to be at least half a dozen other wives that might be there that they may not know personally, but the whaling community wasn't very big, so you knew of the wife, even if you didn't know her well.
Oh, I had no idea.
Or there was gamming. That was another.
Gamming?
Gamming is when ships would see each other in the midst of the Pacific, say, and they would recognize the ship because of the flags they were flying, just like a car has a license plate. That's how you identified the ship, by the flags that were flying. And they would couldn't come up to each other, and you couldn't drop anchor. You're in the middle of the Pacific. But you would match speeds, and if there was a wife on the other ship, you might go over to that ship, or she might come over to your ship, and you would have a social gathering. But they called it gamming.
How would you get? How would one person get from one ship to the other ship physically?
Yeah, yes. There was two ways you could do it. There was something called a gamming chair, and that was risky because you could end up getting dunked. And what they did was they had lines on ship 1 and lines to ship 2, and they would be a big barrel cut out to form a seat, and the woman would sit in that barrel and be hoisted over to the other ship. But she may have gotten dunked if the sailors weren't paying attention. Not drowning dunk, but wet. And when you have all those clothes underneath that, you can weigh a ton. Or they could get into the whale boat, because they were whale boats, small whale boats. They were about 25, 30 feet. They could get into that. The boat would then be lowered, and they'd row over to the other ship.
You know, it's fascinating to hear you talk about that, because I'm a member of several different writers' groups. And in those groups, sometimes there are smaller groups that get together several times during the year, or monthly or weekly for a critique group or something like that. I can't imagine what it would be like to go for several years and not have that camaraderie, or what did they call it? A society.
Society
of
female friends. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I've often heard, and I don't know if it's true or not, that there were superstitions about having women on board. Is that true?
That's true.
Well, how'd they deal with that?
Well, the major superstition was that women were bad luck, and shouldn't. And early in the early 1800s, when women weren't really going, it really didn't start till about 1835, somewhere in there. It was bad luck to have a woman on board, and that was not her place. She did not belong on a ship. That was a man's world. She belonged at home, in her home, and taking care of her children and her husband, even if he was away. But one woman, I believe it was about 1825, said, "I'm not staying home anymore. I'm not worrying about where he is, if he's coming back. If I have enough money to get me till he returns, I'm going with him." So she once one woman does it, once one person does it, it makes it a lot easier for the others to follow. And at the height of whaling, which was approximately about 1840 through about 1860, just about the Civil War, I believe there were around 200 ships out of Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard area, New Bedford, and of those, 60 ships had women and or children on board. So
that gives a whole different perspective to the history, of what the history looked like when you think about whaling. And that makes me wonder too. I was just down at Mystic the other day with some relatives who were up here visiting, and we were looking at scrimshaw. And I remember seeing so many of the art renderings were so feminine, pictures of women and profiles. And I remember thinking how these men must have wonderful memories, but if there were women on board, or a woman on board, there would be a way, I guess, to be artistically inspired.
Yes, and some of the sailors, although some objected, not all of them wanted a woman there. There were those that objected, and they didn't necessarily say so, but there were others that liked to have the woman there. And because, as I believe one sailor said, it's a kind reminder of the finer things, or the more civil things that are at home awaiting for us.
Oh, that's nice.
And when you see the scrimshaw, a lot of the scrimshaw could have been made for perhaps a sister or a sweetheart or a wife at home. And the scrimshaw was very, very much unique to the New England area.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Whaling vessels, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to mention for those of you in the audience now, we were not able to bring some of the artifacts that we had hoped to be able to show you, but you can see a lot of pictures on Karlee's website, and you'll see that information ID'd here, several times throughout the show. And that can lead to the website for Mystic.
Yes.
And I want to get
have
into
a link to that.
I want to talk about the Mystic Seaport, because you have a connection there as well. And I wondered when I started exploring your website, first, did you always like history? Was that a subject you grew up with and always fascinated by?
No, I used to be bored by history.
Really?
Yes, I was. In high school, I had no interest in learning about dead people, mostly dead men back then, who did whatever they did to the country, because all we learned was their names and their dates. And I didn't have any interest in the political history, shame on me, but that was the way it was.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I went to school as an adult, I went back to school to get my bachelor's degree, because I didn't do that when I was younger, that I took a couple of history courses, and there were 4 professors who I'm still in touch with. I adore them. They're my mentors. I love them. And they showed me history in a whole new way I had never imagined before. The one that stands out most in my mind is when we were learning about colonial America. And we had a stack of, I think, 10 books that we had to buy. And they were biographies, but they were biographies based on a lot of fact. And suddenly I saw George Washington and Thomas Jefferson as real people that had faults. They weren't perfect. And then I learned about the Salem witchcraft trials. And I just, from that point on, I loved history, and I love it more and more as I go along. And I did take some women's history classes. And that was really kind of what fed my interest in women's history, and that's my mission, is to teach people more about women's history.
I think that's a wonderful mission, and I'm glad you're doing that. I want to get to that in a minute too. But I'm thinking in my mind about the chronology. So what led you, if there's anything specific you could even think of, that led you to Mystic Seaport and the work that you do there?
Well, we were members for years.
Being family?
Yes.
Okay.
We were members for years, and we would go there occasionally, not very often. And when I was teaching in the Bridgeport school system, I needed a summer job. And I ended up being in lantern light tours. And that was my first winter that I did that. And I was talking to the director, and I said, this is a really fine place to work. It'd be great for a summer job. And that's where it started. So I started as a part-timer during the summer, started full-time in the fall, worked for 3 years in full-time work. And during that time, my interest in women and whaling wives just grew and grew and grew.
Well, you were right in the heart of everything,
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to back up just a minute, because you mentioned something a minute ago I want to talk a little more about, and that was the lantern. What is it called?
Lantern Light Tours.
The Lantern Light Tour. What is the Lantern Light Tour?
That is an annual event that Mystic Seaport has for the last 30 years done. And it occurs every December. And every December, it is Christmas Eve, 1876. And every year there's a new story. There might be one character that's carried over from the year before, but every year it's a whole new story.
But the story isn't reenacted on just December.
No, it's done through the entire month of December,
Okay,
every Friday and Saturday night.
Okay.
Tours are at 5 and end at, I think, 9:45, and they leave every 15 minutes. And there's a red tour and a green tour, so you could conceivably have a few hundred people going through there in a single night.
Oh, I see. So for the month of December, on the weekends, you go to Mystic, you take the Lantern Light.
In the evenings.
In the evenings.
Yes.
And then the Lantern Light Tour, there's a story.
It's essentially it's a dramatic theatrical production, but instead of sitting in the audience watching a play on stage, you are moving with the character, usually the tour guide or the town person who's leading you through that story. And you're in different parts, different buildings for each scene. And you're getting a different part of the story as you progress through those different exhibits. And by the end, you have your whole story.
So year after year, the story, it's not the same story.
No, it's not the same story.
But it's not totally different. You continue characters.
The only thing that's the same is it's wonderful. None of us age. It's always Christmas Eve 1876.
Oh,
and it's been Christmas Eve 1876. I think for 10 years I've been doing it. So it's wonderful. I haven't aged at all in 10 years.
I did really. That's wonderful.
But yeah, so it's then there are some aspects of it that are the same. You always get a carriage ride on the trolley or the omnibus. You always hope to see Saint Nicholas or Santa Claus. There's always a cookie, homemade supposedly. There's always a walk onto one of the ships, and there's always an old-fashioned dance. So those 5 aspects have to be interwoven into whatever the story is that you're presenting. And as I mentioned, there's usually, it could be all new characters, perhaps a carryover from one character from the year before.
So it's like a spin-off or a sequel to a novel.
Bit. Yes, yes. One year we had a story based on Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and the end left the state of this character, the man that was the Charles Dickens similar, totally in a state of chaos. Well, not chaos, but everyone wasn't sure if he was going to be married to this woman or not. That's a little different than Christmas Carol, but we like happy endings at Mystic. And so the following year, we didn't originally have it because I was on the script writing team at that point. They wanted us to bring him back because people kept saying, well, what happened to Mr. Blackburn? What happened to Mr. Blackburn? So we had to, at the very beginning of the story the following year, we showed that Mr. Blackburn had gotten married and he and his new wife were very happy.
Well, I like that very much. And you just created the perfect segue because I wanted to know about your involvement with writing writing some of these stories, and you just mentioned that there's a team.
There was a team. It's different now. I served on the writing team, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years. I've lost track. And we would meet, we'd be given, say, our scene that we were going to write, and we would meet once a week. And so we had a common thread, some continuity from one scene to the next. And several years ago, they changed that. They decided that they only wanted one writer. And so they asked for ideas from all the participants, the actors. And so I have submitted a number of ideas over the years, some taken, some not. But one year in 2009, they selected my story idea. And so I did the script writing for that. And
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, my daughter and son-in-law, they go every year. It's celebrating their anniversary, his birthday, and that's part of the tradition. And our grandson stays with us for the weekend, and that's a big deal for them to go to.
There's
a
lot of families that we have that have come back for years. It's part of their Christmas tradition.
I think it's beautiful.
Yeah.
So when you then not only in writing, but you play a character.
Yes, I do.
So who's the character you play?
Well, my character for Lantern Lights is the same character I play during the rest of the year as a role player at Mystic Seaport. And she is a whaling captain's wife who went to sea, who actually grew up at sea with her father and went to sea as an adult. And so it's the same character for me for Lantern Lights as it is during the summer for role playing or when I'm doing other programs for the Seaport or even on my own.
Is she a real person or a composite?
She is a composite character. Mystic prefers not to use real people, and I can understand why, because you don't want to say or do something that might be offensive to another family member that's still living.
Or a mistake by accident.
So we create the name Weldon. There was a real whaling captain named Weldon, but his name wasn't necessarily William, as is my character's husband's name.
Sure.
And so the name is made up. But all the stories that I tell, whether I'm role-playing for Mystic the rest of the year or for Lantern Lights, are based on the real stories of real women who went to sea.
Did you like to dress up when you were a kid?
Yes.
I wondered because I'm looking at the pictures on your website and I thought, oh, that has to be so much fun. And I want to talk a little bit about the costumes. And if you're just joining us, I'm talking with Karlee Turner, and she is a historian, she's a writer, she is a re-enactor, and she brings women's history to life. So, Karlee, I want to get into a little bit particularly about the fashion knowledge that you've gained and that you share with others, because I know you go all over. You speak to groups everywhere. I know you spoke at the Historical Novel Society in California just recently about Victorian fashions from the inside out. Tell us a little bit about the presentation, and let me just say before we do, you're going to be fascinated by it. And if you're a part of a group, and if you're one of those people in a group where you're always looking for a speaker, I have seen Karlee speak. I've seen the presentation. It's absolutely wonderful. Not something we could do here on the show, but you can contact her and have her come and do a presentation for you. So, Karlee, what do you do in the presentation?
Well, it's definitely a multimedia presentation. I start in my underclothes. In the first layer or two that a woman would wear in the 19th century. And as I go over each layer and each part of the fashion costume, I talk about it and how it might have changed, and the connections from one to the other, why there were so many layers. And I dress from my undies all the way to my street clothes, including the hat and the gloves. And I don't usually have my parasol because it's not sunny, but the hat, the gloves, the purse, or the reticule, they call it. And then after I've done that, I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I go through 1800, 1820, right about through 1880, with actual pictures of women's fashion from museums. They're not pictures I made up. They're not pictures they're from museums. So they're accurate dresses of what was worn in different eras. When
you give this presentation, I'm thinking about the one you did for the Charter Oak Romance Writers, which is where I saw the presentation. And of course there are many of the writers there who are writing in a historical time period, and of course, and the Victorian period is so popular. So I know what many of those women were surprised, the wow factor, watching you do this. But when you do it for other people, what are they most surprised by?
The number of layers that a woman actually had to wear underneath that dress to get that silhouette, whatever it was, whether it was the more straighter dress of the 1820s or the more bell-shaped dome-shaped of the 1850s, or the huge Scarlett O'Hara dresses of the 1860s. They're amazed by how many layers it took to get that appearance. And the other thing that interests them is, I do it for 1876, so I wear bustle. And before that, they couldn't tell, how do you even sit down? That's always a question I get. How do you sit down? And the other thing that interests them is the amount of time it took to get dressed.
Yeah, that was an ordeal.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, you didn't run in for 5 minutes and go throw a pair of jeans and a t-shirt on.
No. And as I tell them when I'm doing my presentation, I always want to make sure. Now, when we get dressed, what do we do in the morning? We put on our clothes. The last thing we put on usually is our shoes. Can't do that if you're wearing a corset, because you can't bend over. So you would put on your stockings and your shoes before you put on your corset. And go from there.
So my first thought is, why would women do that? And yet I look at some of the fashions today and ask this.
I don't have an answer to that question, except we dress the way that's fashionable. And especially in Victorian New England, whatever Paris, or sometimes England, but whatever Paris was wearing, we wanted to have the same. And it was Godey's Ladies Book and Peterson's Magazine and some other women's fashions that helped us figure out what the latest fashions were.
Even if latest to us wound up being several years after it hit the Paris runway or something, but that's what it took. Yeah. Now, I know, just because I know you, that you are interested in historical recreation of other women. Tell us a little bit about some of the other women you're creating and that you're going to bring to the world.
Well, my goal is eventually to have at least one woman from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So right now I have my whaling captain's wife, and the newest one I have is a real woman. That's different. She's not a composite. She's a real woman who disguised herself as a man, fought in the Civil War, did not get discovered like so many did, and actually about 20 or so years later collected a pension. And her story is fascinating. Well, anything that's, a woman, especially disguising herself as a man, is, I think, fascinating.
It is.
And in that presentation, I start out dressed as a man. And towards the end, when I give a first-person presentation, meaning I am her character. I am speaking in first person and her experiences. And from there, I throw on my 1860s bustle or skirt. I quick throw on a hairpiece, and then I show a PowerPoint for that as well. So about some of the other women that fought in the Civil War, and there are a few that died. They weren't just, they were disguised as the women who disguised themselves as men, not the women who were part of the war as women. There were plenty of women that did what they could in the camps and things to help the men. And my latest interest is looking at a 18th century woman. I have just started that research, so I'm not far enough yet to present that to anyone.
Okay.
But that is an 18th century woman who is a loyalist woman, not a patriot woman. I have a thing about the underdogs in society. And when we learn history in school, we hear about the war of the revolution, but we hear it from the patriot side. We don't hear about the loyalists and what happened to them during the revolution.
And there are always two sides.
And there are always two sides.
So when you get this information, when you create this character, and I'm assuming you're going to create costumes, since fashion is so much of your expertise, that you will have the clothing appropriate for the person. And then I'm guessing here you go to schools, go to libraries, women's groups. Where do you bring this?
To collect my data or to present it?
No, to present.
To present. Well, I'm hoping to get to libraries. I haven't done that yet. I've done women's groups. I've done some schools, and I've done a couple historical societies.
All right. Now, I know, too, for people like me who enjoy writing the historical novel, I'm always looking for good research. And on your website, you have a recommended reading list.
Yes.
A very impressive recommended reading list. And I wonder, from the information you have on your reading list, and I'm guessing other people like me who might be researching a particular topic, do you hear from people who have come to you, who have found information on your website for their research?
Yes.
Does that ever happen?
I do. I have my most recent one, and I thought was my most exciting one, was a gentleman who was researching his great-great-grandmother, who actually went to sea with her husband on board a whaling vessel. And I only have a very small bit of information on her. It's in a book called Whaling Wives, which unfortunately is no longer published. But it's a story. I believe it's the woman who talks about being in a hurricane.
Karlee, and I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I missed a time cue,
Okay.
and I'm getting the signal that we are unfortunately out of time. So
Right.
I am going to tell everyone in the audience, please go to Karlee's website. You will see this information. You will see lots of great information and photos and links to other very helpful sites. So Karlee, thanks very much for being here tonight, and a thanks to my Full Bloom crew as well, and to you in the viewing audience. I say this every week, and I mean it sincerely. I do know the value of time, and thank you once again for sharing an evening with me. Do join us again next time.
Full Bloom is brought to you in part by the following: